This is Intelligence Matters.
I'm your host, Jeremy Bash with Beacon Global Strategies. Today, I'm joined by Frank Kendall, who served as Secretary of the Air Force under the Biden administration. Fighter jets, long-range strategic bombers, hypersonics, space satellites, and nuclear weapons. All of these platforms were fielded by the Department of the Air Force and the Space Force under the leadership of Frank Kendall. Mr. Kendall previously served as Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics in the Obama administration. He's got more than 5 decades of experience in engineering, defense acquisition, and national security affairs. And today, Frank Kendall joins us for an exit interview where he will talk about key accomplishments of the Department of the Air Force, the national security environment that the next administration will have to deal with going forward. Stay with us as we speak with Frank Kendall. Frank, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jeremy. Great to be with you.
Frank, I want to start with your time at the Air Force. And maybe you can just begin by telling us how you see the strategic focus of the Air Force and the Space Force evolving to address the emerging threats from near-peer competitors.
I think during my time in office, I had reasonable success in reorienting the Air Force and the Space Force to focus on China as the pacing challenge. China is a strategic threat to the United States, and I would say more formidable even than the Soviet Union was. I spent the first 20 years of my career as a Cold Warrior, and I have a visceral appreciation for what it's like to have a true strategic competitor. And I think getting the Air Force and Space Force oriented on that problem was one of my accomplishments as Secretary.
And were they not focused on it?
Not to the degree they needed to be. We had gone through quite a long period of dealing with counterinsurgencies, counterterrorism fights. And we'd also gone through a long period of very tight budgets. So the Air Force had essentially reoptimized itself around rotational deployments to the Middle East done under a stringent financial situation overall. So it had not been investing the way it needed to be. And there's been a presumption of U.S. dominance ever since the first Gulf War, which is now well over 30 years ago. That presumption is no longer valid. But we hadn't really caught up with that, I don't think.
So let's talk about air power in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, in the zone of potential conflict where we might meet China head-on in a direct, all-out major war. So talk to us about the tyranny of distance, the combat environment, China's capabilities, and what the United States will need to field in order to both to deter conflict, but also ultimately to prevail.
Yeah, it's a great point. You have to start with how you're right about time and distance in the Pacific. It's a vast theater compared to others. China has been building a force that's purpose-built, that's designed to deter the U.S. from intervening in the region or to defeat us if we do. They basically take advantage of the fact that to get into a fight, particularly over, for example, Taiwan or even in the South China Sea, that we have to project power from a pretty significant distance away. And we have to do so from a limited number of bases. We also have to do so with the support of a relatively small number of satellites in our current configuration. So they've identified targets that they think are high value to them and of high importance to us, and have fielded a force which is designed to go after those targets as effectively as possible.
And would the concept be to sort of make a surprise move on Taiwan and then kind of basically win the war before we could even get our boots on?
I think that the first thing they would try to do is deter us. They would try to demonstrate the capability to inflict very high damage on our forces in order to keep us from intervening. At the point at which they think we are going to intervene, then I would expect a large-scale attack against our airfields in the region, against some of our key logistics and command and control nodes, against some of the satellites we depend upon for surveillance and communications, et cetera, and on any naval assets that they could target in the region.
And so when we think about the role of the Secretary of the Air Force, which of course under the law is to raise, train, and equip the Air Force and the Space Force, What kind of platforms were you focusing on during your tenure as secretary as the kind of the key warfighting platforms that would be a differentiator in a potentially high-end fight in the Indo-Pacific?
We had to address the perceived weaknesses that China was trying to attack, and there were several of them. In space, we had to go to more resilient architectures. So we needed to proliferate our capabilities in space, disaggregate them, distribute them more. We also had to acquire a counter space capability because the Chinese were building targeting systems and command and control communication systems to target the joint force. So Space Force has a role in protecting the joint force. It also has a role in supporting the joint force. And in both areas, we needed to transform from our current assets to ones that we just didn't have. On the air side of the equation, we had to get to a next generation set of capabilities that could operate from austere air bases, that could be cost effective against the type of threat that China was posing to us. And we have to get resiliency again there, particularly for our air base defense and survival, which meant moving off of the very small number of air bases we have and operating from a number of other locations and being able to move forces around and support them logistically. China is also challenging us very directly in the air. Things like electronic warfare and long-range counter-air weapons are being brought to bear against some of our high-value assets. Again, surveillance platforms like the AWACS platform and the JSTARS platform, for example. So we had to respond to all of that and do so fairly aggressively.
And so when you envision potentially what air dominance looks like in the context of this theater, you needed to make some big investment decisions and you needed to make some tough calls. And so maybe talk us through some of those big investment decisions and some of those tough calls.
Probably the biggest one, and for me it wasn't really a tough call, was the introduction of what we call uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft. These are aircraft that are relatively inexpensive. They're lethal. They carry weapons. There are a number of them, think maybe 3 to 5, for example, controlled by a crewed fighter. And they become a formation that fighter pilot controls in addition to his own aircraft. So the key technology there is autonomy and automation that has matured quite a bit over the last several years and had gotten us to a point by the time I took office where I felt that the Air Force could make a commitment to fielding that kind of a capability. So we did. We moved forward. We had several $1 billion actually in the budget. The first two contractors are on contract now to build prototypes and then transition into production. And within the next few years, we will have those aircraft in the inventory in meaningful numbers. So that's one area in which we're moving forward very quickly.
Before we move on to another area, I just want to ask you about that area. So we've seen drones in the battle space for almost all of the theaters we've been watching since 9/11. We know that drones can conduct intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions. They can also conduct strike missions. So how would CCA be different from the kind of the drone fleet that we've seen over the last 20 years?
Think of it as a wingman for the fighter pilot, or think of it as a way to take the things that would be stored under the wing of the manned fighter and put them out on other platforms that he can control. You mentioned the tyranny of distance in the Pacific. In the Pacific, we have to operate from hundreds of miles away to get to the place where where combat's going to actually occur. So you need platforms that are designed for that. If you look at the Ukrainian situation, for example, or even the Middle East, distances there are relatively short. So smaller UAVs, unmanned aircraft that can perform attack missions in particular and surveillance missions have been proliferating in that theater. So it's a very different set of military requirements when you talk about the Pacific. And we're talking about control of the air here. We're talking about something that's not really been contested very much in Ukraine. And in that theater, neither side has been able to control the air. And that's another issue in itself that we have to address, of course.
So we're talking here about the realm of TAC air, or tactical air. Just again, question about this autonomy phenomenology. So you see autonomy as being a critical technology pathway for this loyal wingman formation of aircraft flying off the wing of a crewed aircraft. Just why not have all of the aircraft be autonomously either remotely flown or autonomously flown? Why do you need people in the cockpit at all?
For several reasons. I think ultimately, we may end up with a situation where you could be completely autonomous vehicles, but you have to have secure control, command and control of those vehicles. And to have things in relatively close proximation to have secure communications link is critical. You also want to be able at this stage of the game to have some operational control to ensure that they're being employed appropriately and to optimize and maximize their use and their efficiency together with the crewed aircraft. So the combination, that man-machine interface, if you will, that teaming, creates a powerful capability. And the last thing you want to have happen is to lose communications to the aircraft, and they would then have to default to some behaviors that were programmed. But even worse would be to have the adversary take control of those things away from you. And having communicators that are secured in close proximity is a strong way to prevent that.
So we've been talking about CCA. Another program or project that you worked on in the realm of tactical aircraft was called NGAD. And maybe you could just talk about that a little bit. I know many elements are highly classified, so you won't be able to talk about them. But what can you tell our listeners about NGAD?
The question there has been about the NGAD platform, the sixth generation fighter, if you will, next generation air dominance. It's a program that I actually started. In about 2014, I initiated a program called the Aerospace Innovation Initiative, which was designed to mature technologies for the next generation of tactical aircraft after the F-35. It was funded jointly by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the Navy, and the Air Force. And I started that program to mature technologies without much certainty about what exact concept what kind of an aircraft they would actually be integrated into to provide military capability. That program was successful. What the Air Force did with it was put it into a platform design that is essentially an F-22 replacement. The F-22 is a purpose-built counter-air focused fighter aircraft. And it is an aircraft that exists in very small numbers in the Air Force, only about 175. It's expensive. But so the NGAD platform design that we currently have is a follow-on to the F-22. It's very expensive. It's going to cost multiples of an F-35. So the question on the table right now is that really the best investment for the Department of the Air Force? There's a substantial research and development bill that you have to pay tens of billions of dollars before you get your first airplane. And then each airplane is going to cost over $200, maybe $300 million, that roughly in that area. So given the financial situation that the Department of the Air Force had at the time I left, it was not at all clear that we could afford the aircraft at all, or that if we could, that it would be the best investment for us to make. We didn't reach a final decision on that. I didn't feel that with us departing at the time we did, with a new team about to come in, that it was appropriate for us to make a decision that could easily be reversed or that would bind the next administration. So we left it on the table. A great deal depends upon how much funding the Department of the Air Force gets for modernization and whether where that line falls. There are other priorities that for me are higher than the sixth generation aircraft, and I would fund those first before I did that. And I think there was general consensus about that. Address some of the needs that I talked about earlier. So it's up in the air right now, and a great deal. It's not an unuseful thing to do. Certainly, it would be a generational improvement over the F-35 and the F-22, but it might not be the best investment, and there might not be enough money to afford it.
So this is a decision that your successor will have to grapple with, and it sounds like the question is, what do we want the next generation of fighter aircraft to be? What do we want it to do? What kinds of missions do we want it to engage in? You referenced the F-22 as sort of a counter-air platform. Does that mean dogfights? Does that mean going up against head-to-head Chinese sixth-generation aircraft? Is that sort of the mission set that you're looking at? Is it penetrating dense air defenses in places like Iran or North Korea?
We have a large inventory of aircraft that are going to be very capable against everybody else except China or possibly Russia. Mostly China, because China is much more aggressive in their investments in this area than Russia is at this point, and working very hard to field an Air Force that can take the United States Air Force on. The air combat has changed over the decades, and the traditional idea of dogfighting is pretty much not the way you should think about it anymore. Engagements are occurring at increasingly long ranges, so the ability of your sensors to detect and target and track the adversary's aircraft and the range at which you can do that successfully is a critical parameter, and the range of your weapons is a critical parameter. You can throw into the mix electronic warfare capabilities as well. So the traditional idea of people trying to outmaneuver each other and pull G's in order to get an advantage, if you get into that position, you already have not succeeded in your air combat operation. So things are going to be different in the future, and they're changing fairly quickly. The introduction of uncrewed aircraft as part of the force opens up a whole range of tactics that aren't available when you have every aircraft crewed for a number of reasons. You can sacrifice one of these to obtain an advantage. You're not likely to do that with a crewed aircraft, with a manned aircraft. So things are changing, they're quickly, and there's a race on to get this right and to get it fielded more quickly. And it's not clear to me at this stage in time that going down a more traditional road of just getting a better version of what we already have is the right answer. Alternatives are a design that is more focused on control of CCAs and more built around that function. And it's possible at some point that we go away from crewed fighters altogether. Our current inventory has got a lot of life left in it. We could continue to buy the things that are already in production. So that's another alternative. Those are both other alternatives. Something that has more of a multi-role set of capabilities and is less focused on control of the air as the primary mission would also be a possibility.
So I must ask you about the F-35, which is probably the largest aircraft procurement program in American history. It's an aircraft that spans not just 3 military departments, but also several nations that are part of the F-35 program. What do you see as the future of the program, and what do you see as some of the kind of key strengths? I mean, if you're kind of talking to the new Trump team about the F-35, what do you want them to know?
The F-35 is by a wide margin the best fighter, the multi-role fighter certainly that you can buy today. I think it's going to be in the inventory for a very long time, and I think we're going to buy quite a few more of them. It's interesting how it's proliferated. There are approaching, I think, 20 nations right now that are buying the F-35, and the list has been growing. Finland recently moved to acquire it. The F-35 is upgradable, and the current version, which is struggling to get into production at scale, offers a lot of advantages. Increasingly, it's not so much the fighter itself or its aerodynamic performance, it's the things that are on it. The sophistication of the radars and the infrared sensors, the sophistication of electronic warfare capabilities, the combination of things that make it harder to detect and harder to engage. All of those things matter, and the F-35 is well ahead of anything else that's fielded today and getting better. So I think the F-35 is going to be the mainstay of our own Air Force and most of our partners' Air Forces for the foreseeable future. As we introduce CCAs, they're going to proliferate also, and the F-35 will be a good platform from which to control them. So I think that's the kind of the core mainline course that we need to be on beyond with our partners. We do want to have partners, particularly in the Pacific, who have state-of-the-art capabilities, who can fight together with us and take on this increasingly formidable threat that China is posing to us.
Turning from TAC Air to maybe the bomber fleet for a moment, the Air Force is really organized around this platform called B-21, the Raider. And maybe you could just say a word about what you see as happening in that program and what you see as the future of the long-range bomber force.
I've been involved with that program pretty much since its inception, and it's been a reasonably successful program. I'm going to knock on wood here because there's still some testing to go. We're not out of development entirely yet, but we're entering into production. And so far, the program has performed very well. I give a lot of credit to the program office on the government side as well as to the contractor who's been working the program. My question mark about the B-21 is how many should we really buy? We have a relatively small bomber fleet. It's B-1s, B-2s, B-52s, and soon the B-21. The imagery objective right now for the B-21 is relatively small. I think we need to shift the balance in the Air Force towards more long-range strike capability. And the platform that will be available to do that for us for the foreseeable future is the B-21. So I can see larger numbers being bought than we currently plan. There are other things one can do. One can use transports to deliver weapons. We've experimented with that. But I think having more standoff capability in the inventory in general is something we're going to want to achieve.
So again, if you think about the Air Force being responsible for 2 legs of the nuclear triad, the ICBM fleet and the bomber fleet, with these bombers being able to carry either conventional or nuclear weapons, What is the next secretary going to have to deal with respect to the nuclear modernization agenda? And what are both the challenges and the risks?
I think there's some things that the entire national security community is going to have to come to grips with as China matures its nuclear force, expands its inventory to become closer to the U.S. and Russia. A lot of those issues really haven't been addressed yet. But as far as the triad is concerned, and as far as the Air Force legs are concerned, I think they must continue. There's a strategic imperative to do this. Sentinel, the intercontinental ballistic missile replacement for Minuteman, has really struggled. I think we have to continue that program, and I think there's pretty much consensus about that now. I don't think they're out of the woods yet. There's a lot more to go on that program. It's a massive construction project as well as a weapon development program. And interestingly, massive construction projects have much worse records of financial performance than military weapon systems do, believe it or not. I was in Boston for a long time, and we did the big dig up there. That's a good example. So I think we're not through with the cost increases necessarily on the Sentinel yet because of that. The B-21, in contrast, is doing reasonably well, and the question there is going to be how many do we actually build, and how do we decide at the end of the day to employ them. There are other questions about the mix in the nuclear force, about tactical nuclear weapons, for example, about whether what we do in response to the fact that we now have two peer military adversaries, potentially nuclear adversaries, and not just one, which we spent decades. I was, again, a Cold Warrior for 20 years. We agonized over the threat of the Soviet Union and its nuclear arsenal. I don't think we've given nearly enough thought yet to what it means to have three powers, two of which are potentially hostile to the United States.
So, Frank, if we were to detect the North Koreans stacking a missile on a launch pad at Punggye, firing that missile off, we may not know first whether it's a space satellite or an ICBM headed to the United States. Talk to us about the capabilities that the United States has to knock down an ICBM headed for the continental United States. We have missile interceptors at Fort Greely, Alaska, and at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. How effective are those missile defense capabilities?
We have a capability, as you mentioned, primarily in Alaska, interceptors based in Alaska. It's relatively small numbers. It was designed to deal with the threat from North Korea, fundamentally, possibly a threat from Iran. It's not sized for a large-scale attack. The numbers aren't anywhere near what we would need. The new administration, is talking about an Iron Dome concept for the United States, which would be something like, as I understand it, the Strategic Defense Initiative of the Reagan administration, which I worked on. I was part of that. It would be an enormous investment, and one with questionable feasibility, quite frankly, to try to recreate that and build something like that. We never succeeded with the SDI program. The Cold War ended, of course, and so the nuclear threat largely dissipated as a result of that. I mean, it's a noble endeavor, but it has enormous problems both financially and technically and operationally. So yes, we have some capability. It's limited, and I think it's an open question whether it's really a good investment to try to expand that. There are all sorts of stability questions that come to mind that arise once one starts to do that. That said, we do have to think very carefully about how we're going to respond to China's expansion of their inventory and what that means for stability, strategic stability, and how we deal with those problems.
And you may not be able to comment on this given the sensitivity, but if China or some other highly capable adversary were to fire a hypersonic weapon in our direction. And a couple of years ago, we heard about a hypersonic innovation that was considered sort of the new Sputnik moment, seeing what the Chinese had fielded. And also, if you think about the cruise missile threat and other threats beyond the ballistic missile threat from North Korea, this Iron Dome for America, is it going to be able to deal with all of these challenges? Is that the concept?
I honestly don't know what the concept is. The phrase has been put out there, and I understand that in the Department of Defense, at least, they've asked for a number of ideas to be submitted by different groups and through different organizations, through the Missile Defense Agency, the Joint Staff, and the Space Force. It's too early to tell. And you can do something that's fairly modest, designed to deal with a relatively small threat, or you could try to do something that's designed to deal with a very large-scale attack. There is, again, a lot of problems with the latter. So I don't know what the intent is right now. Some degree of missile defense for certain threats I think is feasible and viable and worth doing. I'm more concerned, frankly, about the regional threat of missiles. And I mentioned earlier the threat to our air bases, for example. China has fielded literally thousands of weapons, and they're a mix. They're cruise, they're ballistic, they're hypersonic, designed to attack those targets. So that would be my first priority, is to have more effective defense for those assets. And defense alone won't be enough. Defenses would be overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. So in addition to that, you'd have to use, we were planning on, and it started down the path towards proliferating the number of bases we use, trying to do deception, concealment, and different operational techniques to operate from other places and dilute the threat. So that would be my first priority. We have that problem both in Europe and in the Pacific, although it's much more severe in the Pacific.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Frank Kendall.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Just to talk a little bit about some other theaters where the Air Force certainly is making an incredibly important contribution to our national security. Let's talk about EUCOM and the United States Air Forces of Europe and also of Africa. First, we've heard the new administration may cut AFRICOM altogether. That's a decision that would be pending. And curious about your take about that, and also the role that U.S. Air Forces have played in supporting Ukraine and in defending NATO and being part of the NATO alliance.
The Air Force is not, the Air Force has been involved in a number of ways. Obviously, we have a strong presence in Europe. We do not have much of a presence in Africa. We have limited presence. We have base at Djibouti. And we did have some assets in Niger that are being withdrawn. The AFRICOM, EUCOM are separate commands, but the U.S. Air Force Europe Africa is a combined command under the same commander. And that's so that those assets can be used, that are basically based in Europe, can be used in support of anything we have to do in Africa if necessary. We've been very involved in making sure that NATO's borders are secure, air policing basically, during the Ukraine conflict. And we've been very involved in logistic support and bringing material to support Ukraine. The Air Force itself has provided a number of assets, particularly in areas like air defense and so on. And within the last year or two, we've been training F-16 pilots for the Ukrainian Air Force. So we've been in a support role largely. Most of the material support to Ukraine has been in the ground combat area and have come out of the Army primarily.
And in the Middle East, Frank, in April of 2024 and in October of 2024, Iran fired ballistic missiles, 200 in October, at our ally Israel. And there was a coalition of countries, and the United States played a key role in knocking those missiles out of the sky. And I know that the United States Air Force played an important role, and I was wondering kind of your thoughts about that mission.
It was very successful, and I think Iran was probably quite surprised by how effectively that attack was defeated. The Air Force, together with our partners in the region, was a major contributor to that. Israel obviously has very strong defenses of its own, but we were able to blunt that attack, essentially defeat it. The Air Force has also been involved in operations against the Yemen, where attacks in the Red Sea in particular have been launched out of Yemen, also attacks against Israel. So we've been very much a part of that as well, and defeating some of those and striking back at some of the things that, the sources of some of those attacks.
So let's speculate a little bit about the next couple of years. The budget is going to be a big issue facing the Department of Defense. We've seen a memo or a document saying that there's going to be an 8% cut, but I don't think we know, Frank, right now, is that going to be a cut? Is it going to be a reinvestment? Is there going to be an increase in top line? Kind of, what do you think, or what are you hearing might be the plan here? Because it doesn't seem like there's a particularly announced strategy? Is there going to be a strategic review? What do you think?
I agree with that. I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty, more than I've seen in the past here. The order that went out to come back with a budget that's 8% reduced over the 5-year plan, um, um, basically also protected. I think there was a list of 17 items or areas, one of which was uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft, which I was happy to see. And what I've heard from the leadership in the Pentagon is that this is not just a cut. There's a reallocation consistent with the president's priorities that's intended. But I haven't heard what those priorities are. Some of them that have been articulated really don't affect the budget very much, such as removing DEI and increasing the warrior ethos, so to speak. So I don't know what the intentions are here other than what's on that list of 17 things to protect. More funding could go into those areas. I think, frankly, there's a high likelihood more funding will go into space, something that I would definitely support. We do need to invest more in the Space Force. So, and then the Iron Dome thing's been announced, right, as a possibility. But the scope and scale of what's going to be attempted under the Iron Dome label are uncertain to me. So it's an area, and it's a time in which there's a lot of unknowns. I asked people at a talk I gave just before I left at one of the think tanks here in Washington if anybody in the audience knew if the Trump administration would increase or decrease the defense budget, and nobody's hand went up. The Congress is trying to add some money. It's not quite clear to me exactly what the distribution of that money is over how much is in the current year, the next year, 85, and would be in 86, and how that's spread out and what the intent is there. So a lot of unknowns right now. And as you mentioned, Jeremy, I don't know what the overall strategic goal is. This administration seems to want to be limiting our overseas engagement quite a bit. Which may, kind of is consistent with the idea of an Iron Dome, but they haven't been very specific about that. So there's a lot of questions to be asked here.
When I served at the Pentagon as Chief of Staff, you were serving in the role leading the AT&L office within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as first the Deputy Undersecretary and then the Undersecretary. And you saw acquisition policy and acquisition reform through many decades of discussion on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. I'm just wondering here in 2025, how does that sit? Meaning, have we figured out ways to sort of shorten the acquisition timeline, to reduce some of the hurdles to getting new technology into the department? Do you see some of these disruptive technology capabilities, including AI, competing for some wallet share and for some mind share as well with some of the larger, more traditional platforms?
They are competing, and I took some steps. I was grateful to have support from the Congress for an initiative when I was Secretary of the Air Force called the Quick Start Initiative, which was the idea that we didn't have to wait for the entire budgeting process to initiate a program. We could do early stage risk reduction and concept definition and so on without waiting for approval from the Congress through an authorization act primarily, but also an appropriation. So you could save a year and a half from the timeline just by that. And in normal, if bills are passed on time, with continuing resolutions, you save even more time. So we were able to start a couple of projects that way as a pilot. There's been an endless quest for what's called acquisition reform. It's been going on for decades and decades. At the end of the day, we get some money when we give it to industry to build something for us, and that's not going to change. The way we write contracts and the requirements we set are really the key to how fast we can move. Industry doesn't try to go slow, and neither does the government. Industry moves as quickly as it can. The requirements really that define the product and the degree of complexity and how much you're trying to push for improved technology or better performance drives how long it takes to do a program. So being thoughtful about those things and being willing to accept less will get you things faster, but they'll be less capable. So they're all trade-offs that have to be made in there. I use the phrase acquisition magic. People have been looking for some sort of acquisition magic for my entire career, and nobody's ever found it yet. At the end of the day, we're going to get some money, we're going to hire some engineers to design something, and we're going to try to field it as quickly as we can. There are benefits, I think, in some cases to going to people who are not traditional contractors, so to speak. Some of them are able to make design decisions more quickly. There's always been a tension between the government's control over a program and the freedom you want to give industry to provide you with a product. The customers for our products, have a lot of needs in a product. A military product is somewhat unique. It's got to have certain features to be usable in the field. It has to have certain features to be secure against things like cyber attack. So all of those things matter and need to go into designs. And at the end of the day, people who really understand these things deeply and understand the technical risk deeply need to be empowered to make the right decisions and move forward. That process can be simplified and delegated down, and I think that would provide some benefits. But there's no magic. There's no brand new way to do acquisition. I've seen just about everything you can imagine tried at some time, most of them more than once.
I want to conclude, Frank, with a couple of quick personal questions. So you went to West Point. You had an amazingly diverse career, including as a human rights lawyer, and you've stayed deeply involved in national security and defense, and you've served, I think, at the Pentagon and under almost every secretary since Ronald Reagan was president, in one way, shape, or form, either inside government or advising from the outside. I just have to ask you, kind of here in 2025, how do you see your career as kind of building to this moment where you've been able to lead the Air Force, and what's next for you?
Well, it's been a great journey, and I wouldn't miss any of it. I think of myself as an engineer first, probably. I've spent most of my life at the intersection of technology and military operations, and have learned from some people that are just giants in that field. Bill Perry's comes to mind, Johnny Foster, and a few others. At the end of the day, there is no substitute for professionalism. What you need to have success in this endeavor is very smart, very capable professional military operators who can write requirements and are open-minded about changes to how they do operations. And you need technologists who will work closely with them to field the best possible products to keep the U.S. ahead of our adversaries. Those needs are more severe now than at any time in my career. I cannot overemphasize how serious a threat China is. I've been watching them since 2010. I came back into government after being out for 15 years. They are being very smart, very creative, and moving very aggressively. And I tell people, don't talk about future threats anymore. The threat is here. China is a threat today. It has spent 20 years building a military purpose-built to defeat the United States' ability to project power. And that's something that we really need to come to grips with. And the one thing that I tried to accomplish as Secretary of the Air Force, above all others, was to create a sense of urgency in the department, that we've got to move forward quickly, we've got to make good decisions, we've got to move forward quickly to execute them. And I'm hopeful that I left the department much more in that mindset than I found it.
And I'd like you to comment, Frank, just on the nature of public service, and particularly those who put on the uniform to fight and ultimately potentially die for our country. You've worked with the professionals of our armed services your entire career. Some people think they're political. Some people think they're, not warriors. Can you kind of just set the record straight on this?
One of the truly impressive things about our professional military, which is all volunteer, is that they are completely apolitical. I have been through a number of transitions in the Pentagon. I never knew whether when I was an SES there or an officer or a political appointee, I never knew any officer's political views. I never asked about them, and they never talked about them. We were focused entirely on our mission and having as ready a force and as capable a force as we possibly could. And that is through many administrations, both political parties, switching back and forth. America should really be proud of the people it has serving in uniform. It would be a great tragedy, Jeremy, to see our military politicized. And I'm afraid that some of the things that are happening currently are taking us in that direction.
And the people who put on the uniform to defend us, we should give them our thanks, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. And people who also serve in the Pentagon as public servants, as civilians, people who are part of the industrial base, people who sign up to do this mission, I think are American heroes.
Absolutely. It's been a joy of my life to work with such fantastic people throughout my career. And I would extend that to people in industry. People in industry are patriotic as well, and they're trying to support the department and provide the best products they can. The the national security community, if you will, all the professionals in it, work really hard every day to make America as capable as it possibly can be.
Secretary Frank Kendall, thank you so much for your public service, for your tenure as Secretary of the Air Force, for your 40 years of contributing to America's national security, and thank you today for joining us on Intelligence Matters.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
That was Frank Kendall. I'm Jeremy Bash. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.